I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and I'm so excited that you have made a decision to continue on this journey with me. So if you may recall from episode 1, I talked a little bit about who I am, some of my leadership experiences, and all of the things that really motivated me to start this podcast. So in this episode, we will be focusing specifically on the topic of leadership versus management. And before we get started, something that I like to do in every training and sometimes even in conversation is to establish a basis of understanding. And what I mean by that is, very often there are certain meanings behind certain words, and sometimes we use different words in different ways. And so I always like to make sure that we're all on the same page. And so for this conversation, I would like to start with clarifying those specific terms that we will be talking about throughout this episode. They are supervisor, manager, and leader. So the first one is supervisor, and I see a supervisor as a position, one who oversees maybe a department or a unit, and they essentially are responsible for the performance of those who report to them. So then we have leaders and managers. I would see leadership and management as two different supervisory styles. And so let's dive into that a little bit more. A manager is a type of supervisor. It can also be a title, and that's where I think some of the confusion can come from. Whereas a leader can also be a supervisor, but that may not always be the case. In some cases, a leader can be someone who doesn't necessarily have the responsibilities of a supervisor, but they have individuals that follow them because those individuals believe in their mission or believe in what it is that they're doing, whether it be executing a particular project or overall they see them as someone that they admire. So a leader doesn't necessarily have to be a supervisor, although oftentimes they are, whereas with the manager, they will always be a supervisor. So in preparation for this episode, I wanted to do a little bit more research because I already had some stuff from earlier in my doctoral program, but I wanted to also incorporate some things that were a little bit more recent. And first and foremost, one of the things that I am probably a nerd about is Harvard Business Review articles. That tends to be my go-to for information. I have several of their books, of their top 10 read articles, and often point to them for reference, whether it be for myself or for helping others. There have been many times where I've, lent out a book of the top 10 reads and, gave it to one of my staff members to help them in whatever area that they needed. So nonetheless, I, pulled some articles from the Harvard Business Review. I also pulled one article, I thought it was really interesting. And the article was written by Bridget Hyacin. I really enjoy what she's doing. She's highlighting the different components in the workforce that, need to be challenged. And one of the things that really stood out to me in this article was this one short section where she says, leaders build people through training, coaching, mentoring, and rewarding. They recognize that everyone is motivated differently. Managers, on the other hand, believe people will be motivated if you pay them enough. Leaders understand that pay is a satisfier, not the only motivator. And I think that is so crucial to keep in mind. For some individuals, they think, if I keep paying them, they'll stick around. And that's not always the case. It's really more about fulfillment and feeling like you're a part of a team. And that was actually something that came up in my own research. Feeling a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction is not always connected to money. And if you're interested in any of the research that I conducted for this episode, as well as my own research, feel free to go to my website. So now that we have this understanding of what leadership and management is and how it relates to supervision, let's take that a step further. So if we look at leadership and management as two different supervisory styles, I believe that leadership and management are actually on a continuum. So on one end, you have characteristics that are specific to leadership. On the other end, you have things that are specific to management. For example, leadership focuses more on the big picture, the vision, long-term understanding where this is going. Whereas on the management side, it's more about the day-to-day, short-term goals, putting one foot in front of the other. Leaders may focus on things from a more general standpoint, whereas managers may focus more on specific pieces. For leaders, there's more of a focus on the vision, whereas for managers, their focus is more on the task. Leaders tend to have many hats, especially if they are the head of an organization, whereas managers typically wear one hat and they oversee one specific department or they're focused on one specific area. And while that may not always be the case, that is a little bit more common in terms of the leaders having multiple things that they're juggling, whereas the manager is, again, more focused on a specific area. Another component that's different for leaders, they really try to focus on building trust within their teams, whereas with managers, they use control as a way to get things done. And I think that really connects with this next piece, which is that leaders tend to command respect, whereas managers demand respect. And so I think trust and command go hand in hand, because if you think about it this way, someone who focuses on developing trust will automatically command that person's attention. And, that person may be more inclined to follow them because they trust them. Whereas for managers, having that control and demanding respect, they're essentially operating from a place of fear, like they're using fear to manipulate the people to get the task done. And that's, very different styles when you look at it in that regard. And I think that fits well with the next piece, which is that leaders really lead with influence, whereas managers use power. And, I think those three are very interconnected in many ways for the reasons I previously shared. And then last but not least, leaders really focus on relationships and relationship building, whereas managers focus more on the goals. And goals are what drives the behavior. And so the managers are making sure that the day-to-day activities are leading back to the goals, and that the tasks that are being assigned to their employees lead back to the goals. And so they're very much goal-oriented, whereas for leaders, they're focusing on the relationships because they see the people as bringing value to the organization or to the department, and not just for the job that they have been hired to do. They see them as contributing overall. And so those were some of the specific characteristics that I found in my research, as well as what I feel like I've observed in my own interaction with leaders and managers. I could see examples of both of them in different individuals and was able to understand where each one fell within that leadership management spectrum. However, something that really stood out to me when I was doing this research was that there were three specific things that I could not find a counterpart on the management side, but I felt were worth mentioning here because I feel like this really gets to the core of what separates a leader from a manager. So the first one is that leaders employ aspects of management, but that is not their primary focus. Obviously, the leader wants to make sure the job gets done, which is why they may employ aspects of management. But at the end of the day, their primary focus is on developing the people and developing a culture within the company that really makes people become excited about the work that they're doing and how they are contributing to the organization overall. And I can certainly see how this would play out, because for me, I see myself as more of a leader. However, in my leadership roles, there were times where I had to use aspects of management in order to get the job done. So like laying out the day-to-day tasks and, being specific about, when we do things and how we do things. That was more so for us to get the job done. But at my core, I was really focused on building the relationships and making sure that my team felt connected to the work that they were doing. And so I think for me, I can certainly understand the need for employing aspects of management. So the next item that was specific to leaders was this idea that leaders leave a legacy. And I think that really goes back to the piece about building relationships. Like at the end of the day, leaders want to have a positive influence on their followers and establish a meaningful relationship that expands beyond whatever it is that person is contributing to the team. And I think part of leaving a legacy is making sure that their followers are getting the experience that they need that expands beyond their role at that time. And that's something that I would always do with the people that I supervise, whether it was an intern or one of my long-term staff members. I would always start the relationship with getting a sense for what is it that they wanted to accomplish long-term? Where did they see themselves 5 years from that point? And what are the skills that they specifically need to get them there? And that's what I would try to focus on with them as we went along. And so, particularly with my interns, something that I would do is, I'd meet with them and I would give them the position description and ask them if they had any questions. And then I would also ask them, what are their long-term goals? What is it that they want to do once they leave this internship, or what do they want to do once they graduate? And I would try to make sure that whatever skills that they needed for that particular thing, that they had a chance to work on it with me as part of their internship, assuming it was an experience that I could create for them. Because at the end of the day, I wanted them to be able to take that with them wherever they went. I wanted to make sure that it was a meaningful experience and that they were able to find a balance between the items that I needed to get done and what they felt like they needed to take with them well beyond that internship experience. And so that's just an approach I learned along the way, like knowing that they can look back and say, oh yeah, this experience was really meaningful because it set me up for that. I think that's my way of trying to leave my legacy with those individuals that I interacted with. And the last component that I felt was specific to leadership was that leaders build other leaders. And this really resonated with me because I could see examples of this throughout my career. This is totally going to sound nerdy, but I loved planning our trainings. And I also enjoyed presenting at our trainings. And when I planned the trainings, I would always think about it from the perspective of what is it that can help them not only do that specific job, but also help them long term. Like obviously they're in this role right now, and that's great. And I want to make sure that they have the tools to get it done. But I also want to make sure that whatever it is that they're learning, they can take with them no matter where they went. And so I guess I can relate to this idea that leaders build other leaders because it's something that I had already been doing inherently. And I think this also speaks to why I was always so passionate about planning the training. Like at the end of the day, my priority was to leave people better than I found them. And so those were just 3 characteristics that I learned that were specific to leadership that I could not find a counterpart to in management. Okay, so now that we've established the specific differences between leadership and management, I'm sure you may be wondering, but Dr. Tasia, how do I know when to use leadership or management? Or how do I know where on the spectrum I might fall? Well, there are actually 4 components that I found that I think is helpful for answering both of those questions. So the 4 components are intention, job expectation, experience, and knowledge. So in terms of intention, we kind of covered this already. For leaders, the intention is to leave a legacy, it's to build relationships, it's to build other leaders. Whereas for a manager, the intention may be to hit a certain milestone, to execute a particular project. For the manager, the intention is more focused on the work and the task, whereas for the leader, the focus is more on the people. In terms of job expectations, understanding what is part of one's job description and whether or not the focus is more on leading others or managing others. For example, for a leader, the job expectation may be to create a vision, to build a team, whereas for a manager, the expectation may be to execute this task, hit these deadlines, meet these goals. And that's not to say that, you can't have both in either one, but again, it all goes back to like that first piece of the intention. Like it's very specific about where one is expected to focus their attention. So they are focusing their attention on the people, or they are focusing their attention on the tasks. And so I think that's another distinction. I think in terms of experience, I think for leaders, they don't necessarily have to have direct experience in everything to do their job because they can hire people who have those experiences and can contribute to the team in that way. Whereas for managers, they have to have that experience in order to do their job, in order to help others do their job. Like if they don't have that direct experience themselves, how are they going to be able to train others to do the job that's being expected of them? So they really have to have that experience in order to get the job done. And then knowledge, again, knowledge and experience, it could be either or both. But for knowledge, again, leaders can have the knowledge or not have that knowledge. If they don't, they can find others who do so that, they have someone on their team to make up for that pitfall that they don't necessarily have that knowledge in that particular area. Whereas for the manager, they have to have that knowledge because they have to be able to communicate that to those that they are managing. Like they have to be able to make sure that they're giving the most accurate information to those who are under them. So really, knowledge and experience, there's a lot more flexibility on the leadership side than there is on the management side. For me, I found those 4 components to be really what helps to separate the leaders from the managers. And as I was kind of going through all of them, it made me think about just some of my own experiences and how I could see them playing out in different aspects. So for example, from a management standpoint, in terms of like intention, I shared feeling called to build my team members, to build my students, to build my professional staff members so that they were preparing for roles that were beyond with me, right? So this idea of, giving them tools that will help them long term has always been my intention. And I think that for, some of the people that I've interacted with, that necessarily wasn't a priority. For some of my colleagues, it's not that they didn't care about their teams having the skills to take with them going forward. It's just something that they didn't necessarily focus on. And so for me, I would put them more in that management category because they were really focused on doing the job and doing the job well. Whereas I was focused on doing the job. Okay, we made some mistakes. Let's learn from those mistakes. Now let's do the job well. And just having this sense of being willing to work with them as an intention, I think really set me apart from those that I worked with previously. And then when I think about job expectations, this was one that I found to be most fascinating in terms of my revelation, because at one point I had questioned whether the expectation of me was to be more of a manager and less of a leader. And I'm basing this on just some of the interactions I had with my supervisors, with my higher ups, in terms of, how quickly they wanted things done, in terms of what they wanted me to do, what they wanted my department to do, and just how I approached it. Like, I'm realizing now, perhaps I definitely missed the mark. I will admit that. Like, I definitely feel like I missed the mark as I think about different scenarios, and just feeling like perhaps they were expecting me to do things in a speedier fashion because they were expecting me to be more of a manager. And so on the outside, it kind of looked like I was dragging my feet about things when really I was taking more of a leadership approach, which was to find a way to engage my team, to develop some buy-in. So not just telling them we're going to do this, asking them, how are we going to do this? That was just the approach that I took. And I think that really frustrated some of my supervisors in hindsight. Because, they maybe told me do this thing, and I went back to them and said, well, we're trying to figure it out. And so for them, they may have been like, well, you should have just done it. And that's just not how I approach things. Partially because, again, I wanted to engage my team and make sure everyone felt like they were contributing and, developing buy-in, but also because I didn't necessarily feel like I had all of the answers either. And I didn't want to miss out on another perspective to strengthen whatever it is that we were being assigned to do. So that was just kind of something interesting that I thought about as it relates to job expectations. Just realizing that perhaps there were moments where I was expected to be more of a manager and less of a leader, just so that the task could get done. And that's not to suggest that, we didn't get stuff done. We did, usually with some planning and some engagement and delegating. it was really, about us working on things collectively, not just me saying, you do this, you do that. I was really focused on what's everyone's strengths and then who also has an interest in doing this, so that the person who is overseeing that particular task has more of a vested interest. Because I think when you have more of a vested interest, you have better results, right? And even if they're not good at it, they're going to try to get better because it's something that they want to develop or it's something that they're passionate about. It's just kind of something that I thought about when I was looking at job expectations as one of the pieces that were important for determining, whether they fall under the spectrum of leader or manager. And then in terms of experience and knowledge, I think at the end of the day, one of them is required for both roles. It definitely builds their credibility. I think for this one, it made me think about just my last two types of leadership roles and how having the knowledge and experience contributed to my confidence, whereas not having the knowledge and experience really hindered my ability to be the type of leader that I wanted to be. So just to give you some background. So, I was previously working in a department that I had worked in for over 10 years. And, I worked in that particular department at three different institutions. So even though I was at three different places, the type of work was still very similar. Like there were maybe some different processes and things like that I had to learn. But for the most part, the job was the same, right? And so because I was a resident assistant at some point, I understood the inner workings of being a resident assistant. And then when I progressed into being the head of my own department, because I had experience as a resident assistant and then as a area coordinator who supervises resident assistants, and then as a director of housing who oversees the operations side, once I became the head of my own department, I had some knowledge that was helpful in terms of how I developed the people in those positions. Like I was able to draw from my own experiences, give them some, tools and tips that I found to be helpful, and then, they could take them and apply them in any way that they saw fit. But I think it really helped me to connect with them as their leader. So once I was taken out of that role and put into a new one where I was working with professionals who were in the medical health and mental health arena, I felt completely out of my element, and that really hindered my ability to lead them because I didn't have the tools to connect with them the same way that I did with, my previous teams. I really didn't understand the inner workings of being a nurse or the inner workings of being a counselor, and therefore I couldn't give them the tools and skills that I had learned previously to help them with their growth. And I think that really impacted my ability to be a good leader for them. Now, that's not to suggest I wasn't able to contribute in other ways. I was still able to, focus on the vision. I was still able to build trust. But in terms of my ability to connect with them one-on-one, that was severely impacted because I didn't have the same types of experiences. I didn't have the same confidence because I didn't have the knowledge nor the experience to help them going forward. I couldn't hire the right people to fill in those gaps because we were a small team already. And so it didn't make sense to have, someone in between me and, the nurse, or someone between me and the counselors, because we were a small staff. So the knowledge and experience piece is something that we shouldn't take for granted. It's something that really can set us up for success or set us up for failure. Or, it could really, really impact our confidence level. For me, that's how I was impacted. I didn't feel like I was a confident leader because I didn't have that background experience that I did when I worked in my previous roles. And that was just kind of an interesting revelation I had when I was doing this research, because when I thought about why I didn't necessarily enjoy that role, I attributed it to being something different and new. But then again, I tend to thrive in change. I'm very adaptable. So it wasn't that. It wasn't until I was doing this research that I realized that it really boiled down to not having that knowledge and experience. And I was really drawing upon that as a leader in my previous roles. And I just didn't have that capacity to do so in my last role. And, one of the things that I was really frustrated with was that, I wanted to know those things. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be able to help them in the same ways that I was able to help my previous teams, but I didn't have the time. Like I was, working on finishing my degree and there was a pandemic, and I was also trying to understand a new role that had never existed before. So there wasn't really a book I could pick up and, say, this is how you do it. So there was just a lot involved. And so I think as someone who is truly, truly passionate about leadership and leading people, using experience and knowledge to connect with people, that can be a huge, huge hindrance. That's kind of my takeaway from just my experience and as it relates to today's topic. Okay, so I'm sure many of you may be thinking by now, Dr. Tasia is clearly impartial to leaders. And the short answer is yes, I am. But not because I think that leaders are better than managers. I'm impartial because that's just my preference. That's always been my preference. The idea of being caught up in that day-to-day just never really appealed to me. I did it because I needed to for the purpose of my job, but it was never something that I felt drawn to do. So it might sort of feel like managers get a bad rap, right? And that's not necessarily the case. I think, it depends a lot on how managers are portrayed in television. Like one of my favorite shows to watch is Modern Family. And there was this one episode which came on perfectly as I was preparing for this episode. It was this one episode where one of the main characters returned to work after being a stay-at-home mom for many, many years. Like her oldest child is, I think, 18 or 19. So she's been out of the workforce for a long time. And she goes and works for her father, who has a very successful closet business. And, she's excited and nervous to return to the workforce. And she brings these cookies to give to the people that she is going to be managing. And the father says to her, what are you doing? Like, you're not supposed to bring them cookies. You're a manager. Managers don't do that. And I laughed because the episode was really funny because she made all of these mistakes in terms of like trying to connect with her team. And, it just spiraled into something that just ended up creating more of a headache. But just this idea that managers aren't supposed to show any kind of connection to their supervisees is just interesting to me. Claire is the main character I was referring to, by the way. But it may have been a situation where Claire was, coming in as more of a leader, looking to build a rapport with her team, and her father, Jay, was like, no, you're a manager. Like, managers don't do those type of things. In reality, that may be the case, although I'm sure it was a little dramatized for television, but it's because of those perceptions that managers kind of have this negative connotation of being very strict, straightforward, and to the point. And, we don't get attached to people. We don't show emotion. We don't, do the things that leaders do, that fluffy stuff, which I like to think that for some people that may not always be the case, but who knows? But again, I don't think that being a leader is more important than being a manager, nor that I think that it's any better. I think that both are necessary. I think that both are just as important for an organization. Clearly you need the leader to provide the vision and the big picture thinking and to help move things forward, but you also need the manager to make sure that the job is getting done to get us to where we need to be. So at the end of the day, both are necessary. And I think the reason why I am impartial to leadership is because, again, that's just always been my intention. Where I find it to be frustrating is when you have individuals who sign up for a leadership type of position, but they treat it like a manager position. And it's in those moments where I feel like we are doing a disservice to those that we're leading. Like there's one particular example that I can think of where, for me, the expectation was for my staff to be leaders and they were behaving as a manager. I had this one staff member who, was very versed in leadership, but when there was an incident where there was an emergency, I found it to be very frustrating when they decided to pack up everything at 5 o'clock. So just to give you a little bit of background, we had a situation where a student was missing. We were trying to find them. I was working with my supervisor to execute our protocol for trying to find missing students. I'm working with other departments. And the individual in question, they were actually overseeing the area that the student lived. So one of the things about this individual that was a little unique was that they were very consistent about setting boundaries. And I could totally respect that. I think that when you're in a position where you live, where you work, you need to have boundaries. It brings a whole new level to work-life balance. So the fact that they had set boundaries didn't bother me. What bothered me was that we were in this situation where we couldn't find the student. And so we were all hands on deck. And as soon as 5 o'clock hit, they closed up their laptop and proceeded to head home. And I was a little taken aback by that because, again, my expectation was leadership. My expectation was it's all hands on deck because, again, it's an emergency response situation. It's a crisis situation. And I guess the part for me and how it relates to leadership is, so they decided that it was time for them to go, but they had staff members, so those who were under them, who were still part of the search process and doing everything possible to try to figure out where the student was. I just felt like as the leader, they should have been in the thick of it. I feel like it would have been just as easily for me because I was above them. So, I could easily pack up my stuff and go home too. But given the nature of the incident, I didn't want to leave campus knowing that, this situation was still going on. Even though I didn't necessarily need to be there, I felt like I needed to be supportive of those who were involved, including this particular individual. I have always operated from the standpoint of leading by example. The fact that they were not leading by example was really frustrating. They had this expectation that their staff members would continue with the search, but they were relinquished from their responsibility to also participate. And that was the part that I found to be really frustrating. And there's a part of me that feels like as a true leader, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't leave your folks to, figure it out. You're going to get in the mud with them and help them. And by the way, there was no actual digging or mud involved. That, I'm just using that as an example. But you're going to, stay in the thick of it with them until the problem is solved. That's what I feel like a leader does. And that is not something that they did in that instant. And I will admit, sometimes I have high expectations. So perhaps my expectations were too high, being a leader who leads by example. But I feel like we were putting a lot of extra work and responsibility on students. And so while traditional setting, having that expectation can be a little bit high, but when you're working with students and their primary focus of being in college is to be a student first, I feel like we have to find a way to lessen that, especially given the nature of the crisis. We shouldn't put that all on the students to solve that problem. We have to be equally invested in finding a resolution. But in the moment when I was watching them, pack their stuff up, I was in the middle of trying to figure something out with my supervisor. And so I didn't have a chance to address it in the moment. But I eventually did during our next one-on-one just to, express to them my frustration and disappointment in how they handled that situation. When you're a student who works in higher education, particularly in an RA role, there's a certain level of understanding that in an emergency situation, it's all hands on deck until the emergency is resolved or until your supervisor tells you, hey, you no longer need to be involved. And as someone who had that background, I was just a little taken aback that they didn't continue that thought process going forward as a professional. Now, I've had colleagues who didn't have that higher education experience as a student. And so when emergency situations came up, they behaved the same way as my staff member did. And I could totally understand that because they didn't necessarily have that same understanding as I did or my colleagues who did have the higher education experience. It was just really mind-boggling to me that, this person had this background experience, yet they behaved in a way that didn't seem congruent with the expectation of the job. Another example of where I felt like leadership was the expectation, but management was the approach taken is where I had a staff member who had someone who reported to them that was not meeting expectations expectations. And there was a particular incident where, they were supposed to do something, but they didn't do it, and there was an emergency. And so as a result, that emergency did not get addressed the way that it should have. And rather than use this as a teachable moment, they were ready to fire the student. And I felt like that would be bad on our part, especially given that, they're students, they make mistakes. This was something that could easily be corrected. And at the end of the day, we are in the service of developing students. And while we want them to take things seriously, letting them go wasn't going to change that. And so as a result, we disagreed with how to approach the situation. I wanted my staff member to develop a performance improvement plan with that individual so that they could get better and learn from their mistake, whereas they were ready to let them go and hire the next person. And I think a leader is going to focus on the relationship, is going to focus on developing the person. And so that was my expectation for this particular individual as the leader of that team. But they were approaching it from a management standpoint, which was they didn't do this, therefore they need to be terminated from the position and someone else needs to replace them. And there's just a lot of work that goes into trying to replace a staff member, because we put a lot of development into the training process, encouraging them to build relationships with their residents. And it would just be a lot of work to try to bring someone new. And I think they didn't necessarily see it that way. They just saw it as, well, if we get rid of this person, then I don't have to put in the effort to try to improve their behavior. And so I guess at the end of the day, either way, it would have been a lot of work. But again, we're in the service of developing students. So why wouldn't we take the route of turning this into a teachable moment? And again, I think that's just another example of where the expectation was to be a leader, but the person in that position was behaving as a manager. It's in those instances where I feel like we really have to be intentional about, one, who we put into those positions and making sure that they understand what the expectation is, understanding the differences between a management style and a leadership style, and which components are most important for the role. And in both instances, the individuals had the experience, they had the knowledge, but the intention and the job expectations, there was some confusion. And that's something that I worked with those individuals to improve, but it was definitely a process. And in case you were wondering, we did find the student. They were perfectly fine. There was a situation with their phone where it was lost or broken or whatever, and they couldn't communicate with folks. And then with the second incident, we did not fire the person. The following year, they returned as a staff member with someone else, and they did an excellent job. At the end of the day, all was good in the world, in case you were worried. Okay, so let's recap. And I think it would be helpful to have a pen and paper handy, because I have a few questions, some homework for you to think about at the end of this episode. So first and foremost, the most important thing to understand is that there are differences between being a leader and a manager. And there are certain characteristics that are specific to both types. And it's important for us to understand where we fall on that spectrum. And so one of the things that I want you to think about is, which one are you? Are you more of a leader? Are you more of a manager? And are you okay with that? Are you okay if you're more in the leadership camp? Are you okay with that? If you're more in the management camp, are you okay with that? And if not, what are some of the things that you can do to move you more towards the end of the spectrum that you most prefer? Whether it be the type of position that you're in, whether it be, just your own leadership approach, taking a look at what you prefer and how you can go about exemplifying that through your everyday work. And hopefully I can help a little bit with that with some of the future episodes. All right, so that's point number one. Point number two, there are key distinctions that help us to understand whether someone falls in the leadership or management camp. And so we talked about them as being intention, job expectation, knowledge, and experience. And so something that I would like for you to think about is, what are your intentions? Are your intentions to build up others, as one would if you're in the leadership camp? Or are your intentions to get things done in a specific time frame, which would be more associated with the management side? So really spending some time thinking about what your intentions are in the role that you're currently in, or what your intentions are going forward. So maybe you're in a role that you're okay with now, but you want to move more in a different direction. So just kind of spending some time thinking about your intention. Also, does your current job align with your intention? So let's say if your intention is to be more in the leadership camp, are you in a position to do that currently? And as I mentioned at the very, very beginning, you don't necessarily have to be a supervisor to be a leader. You can lead people in other ways. You just have to, again, set that intention to help develop others, to help build others, right? Or on the other end of the spectrum, if your position is more of a leader and you really prefer to have more of a management approach, is that the right position for you? Do you need to have a conversation with your supervisors about what is expected, and are you able to do that? So again, just kind of spending some time thinking about what are your intentions and whether or not your current role align with those intentions. And then third, I think the biggest piece to take away from this is that one is not better than the other. There is a time and place for both. And part of the learning process is knowing which one needs to be employed at a given moment. And I think that we truly need both in order to get the work done at the end of the day, right? We need both to help us understand our vision. We need both to help us to get tasks done in a timely manner. We need both to build healthy relationships while also setting metrics for accountability. Both are very, very much necessary. So I've shared a lot of different examples, and that's, very specific to me. It's important for you to also see how this has maybe carried out in your own life. So just, kind of open your eyes up a little bit more and look for your own examples of leaders and managers, whether it be you specifically or people that you work with or your supervisors, really spending some time looking at how that is present in your own life. Okay. So that's today's homework, not something that I'll necessarily do every single episode, but, given the nature of the conversation, I felt like it was important to give you some things to think about going forward. So with that said, as I mentioned in the first episode, expressing gratitude and providing an affirmation is something that I will close out every episode with. And so with that said, I will start with my gratitude list. Okay, so first, I am grateful for the leaders and managers in my life who have formally and informally taught me lessons. I think that without them, I wouldn't be able to speak to this topic in the way that I am now. So I'm truly, truly grateful, whether they were people who were leading me or people who, were my colleagues. I think just being observant of their style has been helpful. Second, I am grateful for the leaders and managers I have had a hand in developing along the way. I'm thankful for them because they gave me a different perspective. They gave me something to look at a little bit more differently and to help me understand how I could be more clear in terms of my expectations, but also to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, right? And I think that's just important for every person to keep in mind, especially leaders. So not just seeing it all as a bad thing, like, okay, this happened, this is how we learn from it, this is how we move on, period. And then last but not least, I am grateful for the newfound understanding that I have that I can take with me as I continue in my leadership journey. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I definitely felt like I got a much richer understanding of the examples of management in my life after doing this research, even though I had done research on this previously as part of my doctoral experience. So, you just never know what you may learn when you revisit something, years later. So I'm definitely grateful for just my new understanding of management and how that has exhibited in my life. All right, that concludes the gratitude. Now, for this episode's affirmation, I fully understand and embrace my role as a blank. So whichever you prefer, I want you to fill in the blank. If your intention is to be a leader, I fully understand and embrace my role as a leader. If your intention is to be a manager, I fully understand and embrace my role as a manager. And I think it's important to own that, right? Own who you are at your core and don't feel like you have to be one over the other, unless it's a situation where your job requires it. Then, you may want to look at things a little bit more differently. But if you're able to, if you have that flexibility, do what feels right to you and make sure that you're in positions that align with who you are. And so my hope is that that at the end of this episode, you have a much richer understanding of who you are, whether it be a manager or a leader, and you're able to move forward with that identity and understand how that will impact those around you, understand how that will impact your overall performance, and just owning that as you move forward. I feel like in many leadership roles, there's a lot of imposter syndrome or just doubt. And here's just one more way to chip away at that. In a future episode, we'll talk about just embracing your leadership presence. And so I think that will also help. But for today's episode, just understand and embrace who you are at your core. If you're a leader, great. If you're a manager, great. It all boils down to whatever you feel most comfortable with. So with that said, I thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you next time where we talk about the differences between transactional and transformative leadership. All right. Thank you again and have a great day.